I work at the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, which is a residential high school for students who are gifted in math and science. It's for students in 10th through 12th grade. Part of the reason that I started the research that I do is because I work with a group of Black and Latinx students who are motivated to engage in STEM, do STEM research, enter STEM majors in college, and go on to enter STEM careers. So I wanted to find out, well, what motivates you? Because if you look at the literature suggests something very different about Black and Latinx students. It suggests that they're not engaged in STEM, they're intellectually inferior, they're not able to be involved in challenging work. And so I said, if I can find out from my group of students what motivates them, then I can help to motivate other students to engage in STEM. But before we get started, before I really delve deep into the research, I want to share my selfie. This generation loves to take selfies, right? So this is my identity selfie. So in terms of my race and ethnicity, I identify as Black and or African American. In terms of my sex and sexual orientation, I identify as female and heterosexual. In terms of my gender, I identify as cisgender, and my pronouns of choice are she, her, and hers. In terms of my religion, I identify as Christian. I was born and raised Catholic. Now, this particular part of my identity is actually one I'm in conflict with. So the Catholic Church had provided me with a great foundation, but at the same time, I don't necessarily believe in all of their practices and beliefs. The reason that I shared that with you is that some of the students in your classroom are going to be in conflict with their identities, especially their racial identities as it pertains to STEM. In terms of my age, my class, and my ability, I'm middle-aged. I used to be able to say I was young, but I'm definitely middle-aged now. I'm middle class, and I'm of able body, and I'm emotionally well. In terms of my values and my beliefs, I believe in STEM equity, I believe in being fair, I believe in inclusiveness. That's including everyone of all races, of all genders in the space that I'm in. Do I have bias? Yes, I absolutely do have bias. Am I a good person? I think so. Most of the time I'm a good person, right? And I talk about this because there's bias when it comes to who should be involved in STEM. And a lot of times that bias suggests that Black and Latinx students should not be involved in STEM. And so we're going to talk a bit today about implicit bias that exists and the root cause of that implicit bias. And know that just because you do have bias does not mean that you're a bad person in any way. It's a result of how you've been socialized. Some biased language that's been used against me. I've been referred to as an angry Black woman. Things has been said to me like, I don't see color. Well, when you say you don't see color, because clearly you do see color, what you're saying is that you don't see me. You don't see me as an African American woman. And so that's biased language. And then in terms of my research, I have actually spent my career conducting research specifically on Black males. The reason being, a lot of the research that I read was negative about this group of people. And I knew something different. I had experienced something different in my life. So I wanted to change that narrative. I wanted to talk about Black males in a positive way. And so that's what I sought to do. That kind of has evolved into me working with Black women as well as Latinos, Latinos and Latinas. So I presented my selfie to you all because it's important that you know who you are, but it's also important that you know who your students are. I encourage all of our faculty to gather this sort of information from their students at the beginning of the year. When you have an understanding of who your students are, when you have a relationship with them, when they know that you're interested in who they are beyond their academic selves, it definitely helps enhance their classroom experience with you. It definitely helps to improve their academic experience in your course. So it's important to not only have your selfie, but to know the selfie of your students as well. Now today I'm here to talk to you about STEM. And when I talk about STEM, I'm not just talking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm talking about that along with being STEM literate, along with using the scientific process to solve the world's problems. So STEM is more than just those 4 particular courses. It's the integration of that to solve global problems. So why is this important? First, the United States, we're in jeopardy of being a leader in the global spectrum because we're not being advanced in math and science as other countries. So we need more diverse perspectives. We need those diverse perspectives to solve the problems of the world in healthcare, in education, right? And when you have those diversity of perspectives in solving the world problems, it just creates for more of an innovative perspective and resolution. Oh, I don't know why that changed, but so the value of diversity is so important when it comes to solving STEM-specific problems of the world. Now, what is the problem? Why is it that we don't have Black and Latinx students actually engaging in STEM? One of the reasons is that we have fewer than 10% of Black and Latinx students who are actually completing the high school sequence of mathematics. When you're not completing the high school sequence of mathematics, it makes it more of a challenge to actually enter into a STEM major in college or come to the community college and major in STEM. And if you look at the standardized test scores, Black and Latinx students are scoring far below their white and Asian counterparts. And this is for a variety of reasons. Part of it is lack of exposure to STEM in the K through 12 setting. Not necessarily having a qualified STEM professional who is teaching the students. And we're going to talk about some more of those issues later. So just to give you a little bit of data, in terms of those who are actually majoring in STEM, 18% of Blacks, 20% of Latinx students, and then you have 19% of whites, right? And you say, well, that's not such a huge gap. But look at the retention rates. When you talk about retention in a STEM major, 60% of Blacks, 63% of Latinx students, and then 71% of white students. In this particular study, Asian students were not part of it. Now, if we take it a little bit further and we look at the people who are actually getting STEM degrees, as you can see, the first column, that's associate's degrees. The second are bachelor degrees. So in terms of associate degrees, the majority of students who are getting STEM degrees are white students. Now in terms of bachelor's degrees, it changes. The majority of students are actually Asian students who are getting STEM degrees, getting their bachelor's degree. So as you can see, there's a huge gap, and this gap begins to widen. Well, it gets even broader when it comes to the STEM workforce. Here, you actually have an underrepresentation of Black and Latinx students entering the STEM fields. As a matter of fact, you have less than 7% of Black and Latinx students who actually enter the STEM field. So it just continues to widen. So part of the reason there's early bias, discrimination, and then there are lower social expectations for Black and Latinx students. There's this lack of STEM exposure in the K through 12 setting, a lack of a STEM mentor, a phobia to mathematics. They don't see the real life applicability to their lives, funding inequities in the K through 12 system. I know in the Chicago public schools, a lot of our schools don't even have science laboratories. So when it comes to Students in the K through 12 setting, some of them have not even engaged in laboratory science. So again, how can you come to the college and actually enter a STEM field? Um, and there's a strong STEM pedagogy and resources that are typically lacking in public schools, and there's an inclination to address a perceived deficit with the student rather than focus on changing the system and delivery of STEM instruction to more effectively support and draw on student strengths. So basically, we use this sort of deficit approach to working with our students, and that really has to change. There are so many social injustices that Black and Latinx students experience that it's hard for them to catch up, especially in terms of their academics. They start so far behind that in terms of even getting to that point, like I said before, where they can major in STEM, it becomes so much of a challenge that they just don't do it. And they end up going into something that's a bit more familiar to them. As a matter of fact, if you look at the majors of a lot of your Black and Latinx students, They're majors that focus on addressing social injustices. They're going into social work. They want to do things to make their life better, and they don't necessarily see the connection of STEM to improving the economic and just the situations of their communities. Now, part of the reason that we have these issues is because implicit bias exists, especially in the STEM fields. In terms of what that implicit bias looks like, basically, who's presented as those who are successful in STEM? A lot of times it's white males. If you read our literature, any of the professional literature that's out there, a lot of it is negative about who Black and Latinx students are, right? So if you're a teacher in training and you're reading all of this literature about the negative aspects of Black and Latinx students, you begin to internalize that. And so when you step into the classroom, you think, well, these students don't care about their education. They don't value it. They're not as intelligent as other races, right? And all of that is based on the literature, the professional literature that you've been reading. So you can't help but to develop bias about who this group of students are, right? And so you walk into the classroom, and instead of getting to know them as individuals, instead of saying, like, helping them to develop a growth mindset, you walk in saying, I'm going to set very low expectations for these students because the literature says they don't care anyway. So we have to address the bias that exists with the people who are teaching our Black and Latinx youth if we want them to be more successful, especially in STEM. We see this even more with Black females, right? So you have 77% of Black women in STEM who say they have to actually prove themselves, more than anyone else. People don't listen to them. When they're attempting to solve problems, people just ignore what they have to say. And then you have 48% of Black women in STEM who say they've actually been mistaken for a secretary or a custodian. So people don't even think that they are engaged in STEM. This is a narrative that has to stop, right? So there was actually, some of you may be familiar with this, but NASA had a contest. And these 3 young high school students, they entered that contest, and they had actually developed a method to decrease the amount of lead in water fountains, right? And so this particular contest was supposed to be voted on by the public. Well, when the public found out that these 3 girls, these 3 African-American girls, the only African-Americans who made it to the final, when the public found out about them, they began a racist campaign against them to try to encourage the community, the public, not to vote for them. Right? It was so bad that NASA actually had to change the rules to the competition and say, look, we're not going to allow the public to vote on this contest any longer. This is an issue. Right? These are just some young high school students who are trying to make a difference in the world, and the public, our racist and biased public, started campaigns against them. Right? And these kids are engaged in STEM. Everything about what they did suggests that they love learning. So why the campaign against them? It's because of the bias that exists in our society. So what is the root cause of this bias? Like I said at the beginning of our presentation, because you have bias doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It's because of how you've been socialized. So if you think about when you're born, you're free of judgment, you're free of opinions, perspectives, thoughts. But then as you grow and develop, you begin to hear all these sorts of different messages from your family members, from your peers, from the churches that you belong to, the organizations that you belong to, from the media. And sometimes those messages are either very positive or very negative about a group of people. And if those are negative messages that you're hearing, you begin to develop a negative mindset about this group of people, right? So that's why it's important for us to actually reflect on our bias, to understand the foundation of those messages, and then to put things in place to begin to counter those messages. So this is all based on the cycle of socialization. If you click on the links in this particular slide, well, that was a voiceover PowerPoint I had done. But these are actually 2 links that you can go to reflect on your own bias. All right? And I think everyone should go and do that. It's a starting point for you to understand that you actually do have bias. Once you gain that understanding that you actually do have bias, begin to reflect on it. Well, where did I hear those messages? You know, and then put yourselves in situations to counter those messages. What we're trying to do today, though, in spite of our bias, in spite of the negative literature that is said about Black and Latinx students, is we want to focus on educational equity. We want to make sure that everyone has access, everyone has the opportunities, despite of who they are, some of the injustices that they've had to confront. We want to make sure that there's equity in education. And so this is what equity looks like. Now, in that first frame, right, everybody is there at the beautiful mountaintop, right? Now, one person can clearly see it. The second person, they can see it, but not so well. The last person, they can't see it at all. There's a barrier there, right? And so if you look at the second frame, now we've given people what they needed to actually see the mountaintop. The first person, they didn't need anything additional. They didn't need any additional support. They didn't need any additional resources because everything had been provided for them. The second person, they needed some assistance. They needed a few resources. And when that was given to them, they could actually see the mountaintop. Well, the third person, they needed a lot. They needed a lot of support. They needed that support in class, after class, on weekends, during the summer, right, in order to see that mountaintop. And then the last frame is, that's the point we want to get to. We want to get to the point where there are no barriers, where everyone has that access, where everyone has the resources and supports they need to be successful. But we're a long way from there, especially when it comes to STEM. And so as educators, what's going to be important for you to do is actually begin to look at the patterns of inequity that exists within your classrooms. Know your students' lived experiences so you can have a better understanding of how they've been prepared. Some of them have not been prepared at all. Some of them have been prepared a bit. And some of them have gotten everything that they've needed. But without that awareness, you don't know how to approach teaching and learning in your classroom with your students, right? So you don't know what they need. And so as teachers, we think, well, I'm going to give all of my students the same thing. Well, that's equality, giving them the same thing. What we want to do is get to the point where there's equity, where you're giving them what they need to be successful, but that's knowing what they don't have. And that's going back to the selfie. When you know your students, when you talk with them, when you have conversations with them, when you have an understanding about what's going on in their home, right, in their experiences, then you can personalize your approach. But when you don't talk to them, when you don't have those conversations, when you think it's not relevant, right, because we're focused on academics, that's when our students are not successful. So it is important to have that personalized approach and that relationship with your students if you want them to be as successful as they can be in your classroom. So I wanted to find out, how can we bring equity to STEM? I told you I was working with these Black and Latinx students who are engaged in STEM, who love STEM. And so I wanted to find out from them, well, what motivates you? You know, what keeps you engaged in STEM? So I asked Black and Latinx students, I asked their parents, I asked the teachers who work with them, what motivates you to engage in STEM? All right, then I had two diversifying STEM think tanks, because I wanted to find out from those who are engaged in STEM, STEM professionals, STEM educators, community organizations that facilitate STEM programs. What are the problems? We know some of them, but what are the bigger issues that exist, and what do we do about it? And all of this was rooted in critical race theory, which suggests that you need to have an understanding of people's stories, of their narratives, of their lived experiences, if we want to transform education. So that's what I did. I went and asked people. I brought them together in the same space, and I found out the problem and how to solve it. And so from the first study, what motivates Black and Latinx students to engage in STEM, there were a series of motivational factors that emerged. The first one being nothing has to do with STEM at all. It's the obligation they have to their community to break negative stigmas and to be role models. That's the number one factor of motivation. These students wanted to demonstrate to their ancestors that you paved the way, I've taken advantage of it, I see the value of it, I see the importance of getting an education, and now I want to be a role model so I can continue this cycle in our communities. So that means that in any STEM class, in any STEM program, you have to nurture that obligation. That means you have to talk about issues that impact the Black and Latinx communities. That means that you have to talk about the history of oppression that exists here in the United States of America and the impact that that's had on Black and Latinx communities, right? That means that you have to talk about something that's not STEM related. That's still gonna motivate them to engage in STEM. Number one factor. The number two factor was future success. These students, they understand the economics behind STEM careers. They understand the array of STEM careers that they can engage in. They see STEM as a prominent progressive field, but that's because that's been taught to them, right? They learned that in elementary and middle school, and they brought it to high school with them. At our academy, one thing that we try to do with our students is really bring in people from different fields and have them talk with students. Our students engage in internships. Our students also engage in research. As a matter of fact, on Wednesdays, we refer to it as our Student Inquiry and Research Day. There are no academic classes on this day. Instead, we have students going to Fermilab, Argonne Laboratories, Northwestern University, University of Illinois, and they're engaged in research. And so they're learning about the field. And this is being done at the high school level. And it's a very valuable experience for our students. The number three factor is learning. Now, despite what the literature says that our Black and Latinx students don't value education, these students, they want to learn. They want to discover new knowledge. It's so very important to them. So that's why it's important to have high expectations for these students. They want them. They need them. If we lower the expectations, the students are not going to be motivated. It's not going to be challenging for them. So we have to set the standards high. We have to set the bar high. And we have to have faith that our students can actually reach and meet those expectations. Right? We have to be able to develop a growth mindset in our students. The next one is STEM passion and enjoyment. They just enjoy STEM. I had one student who talked about wanting to just blow up things in her mom's kitchen. Well, that's STEM. And she just loved to do that. So this STEM passion and enjoyment, it came because they've been exposed to it. I had another student share a story when he was about 5 or 6, and he was in an airplane. And for whatever reason, the airplane was grounded. Well, the pilot came out, saw this kid for whatever reason, saw this kid and said, "Do you want to see the cockpit?" Well, the kid was like, "Yeah, you know." And so now this student is at the University of Michigan studying engineering. That one experience, just one day of exposure for a few minutes, someone who took an interest in this kid changed that kid's life trajectory. That's what exposure does. That's what having access does. So if we expose students to STEM, they'll develop that STEM passion and enjoyment, and then we have to nurture it. We have to keep them excited about STEM and the possibilities of STEM. The last factor of motivation that I'll talk about today is advancing the human condition and solving the problems of the world. So many of the students that I actually interviewed, they talked about wanting to change the world. They talked about wanting to improve their family conditions, their community conditions. So what does that mean for the work that we do? That means that there has to be real life applicability. That means that they have to use STEM in your classrooms to solve the problems that are relevant to them. That also means you have to, again, know who your students are so you can know what is important to them, know what problems they do want to solve, make a difference. Some other things that came up is, well, I'm going to talk about this one, family-teacher influence. That was huge, right? Students who had teachers in their lives who were interested in their lives, that motivated them. And they knew when the teacher was not being genuine and when the teacher was being genuine. All right, so you can't just talk to your students when they're doing poorly in your classroom. You have to talk to your student on a regular basis. Just, "Hey, how are you doing? How was your weekend?" That little sentence, that goes a long way. But a lot of times, we don't have conversations with our students until they're doing poorly. And then the student is like, "Well, why do you care about me now? You didn't care about me when I was doing well. You didn't ask me about myself then." You can't wait until your students are doing poorly to have conversations with them and to find out what's going on. You should already know. There was a student from East St. Louis, young man, and we have what you call these extended weekends. So about every 6 weeks, all of our students have to leave campus and go home, and that's to help reduce their stress levels, because these students are engaged in college and graduate level work. Well, this particular student, every time this student would go home and come back, his grades would just plummet. And so our faculty and staff were wondering, like, what's going on? And so a lot of the conversation around this kid was that, well, he doesn't deserve to be here. Well, those faculty and staff, they didn't know him. I knew him. I knew his family. I had known them actually since 5th grade because I was running programs that he was engaged in. Well, what happened is that when he went home on weekends, he would find out his father wasn't around. He would find out that his brothers are being bullied, partially because of him. They're being bullied because they say, "Well, your brother goes to this elite boarding school." What the other kids didn't know is that this is a free school. It's a public school. So the family wasn't paying anything. So they were being told, "You think you're better than everyone else because your brother's at this school." He found out that sometimes he would go home and the lights are off because mom's a single mother working one job and couldn't always afford for the lights to be turned on. So every time this kid went home and experienced what his family conditions, those social conditions, When he came back to school, what do you think was on his mind? Definitely wasn't his academics. That was such a secondary thing for him. The only thing he could think about was needing to be home with his family to help out. But where did his mother want him? His mother wanted him at school because she knew you being at school, it might not help us out right now, but it will eventually, right? But this student, his grades plummeted because he could only think about being at home with his family. You never know what's happening in your student's background unless you ask them. Why do you have a student who went from getting straight A's in your classroom to now failing? Do you know? Those are questions you have to ask yourself. And again, you can't wait until they're doing poorly to find that information out. I knew about my student because I had conversations with the family. I had conversations with him. So I knew about this before his grades began to fail. It's going to be important for you to do that as well. Other factors, challenge, money. Now this one is interesting, right? Because if you go into STEM, you can automatically make about, starting off at like $75,000 a year versus I think the average income for blacks is about $32,000 and the average income for white or for Latinx is about $38,000, right? That's on average, but if you enter STEM, you can start off making $75,000 per year. Now money was a factor of motivation, but you can see it's not in the top 5. Money is not necessarily what really motivates these students, although they should know the economics behind the different fields that they could possibly go into. It's not in the top 5. It's part of something that's really important. These kids really want to make a difference in the world. Other things that motivated our students, some were just self-motivated. A couple talked about not being good at math and wanting to change that. And because they wanted to change that, they worked twice as hard to make sure that they were successful in math. But that was a motivation, them actually not doing well. And other students talked about leadership. Based on the 2 studies that I did, the one focused on motivation as well as the diversifying STEM think tanks, I have developed what I refer to as the D-STEM equity model. And it's a model, if applied, will bring more Black and Latinx students into the STEM education to career pathway. So this is the model. It addresses the systemic problem. It looks at STEM motivation, and it also looks specifically at how we can bridge the racial STEM divide. Now let's kind of go layer by layer. So the top layer is the systemic problem. What are the issues? Now some of these we've known because the research has identified them. Some of them are new. What hasn't happened is that we're not addressing these problems collectively. We've been addressing them in isolation. And in addressing them in isolation, you're never going to get to the point where you truly have solved the problem. So the systemic problem is multifaceted. We first have the vision gap. And when I talk about the vision gap, Black and Latinx students don't see people who look like them who are engaged in STEM. And so it's very hard for them to develop that vision of entering a STEM field. Like I said, less than 7% of Black and Latinx students or of professionals are actually engaged in STEM. So they don't see that. And then if you think about who teachers are, the majority of teachers are white females. So they're not seeing people, again, who look like them who are engaged in STEM. Who do they see that are successful? They see athletes, they see entertainers. And not that there's anything wrong with those professions, right? But a lot of students, they want to go and be an athlete or an entertainer because they're able to really gather that vision of themselves becoming that because they see them. They don't see Black and Latinx STEM professionals. So what does that mean for you all when you're not Black and Latinx? And it's not to say that you can't teach these students, but it's important that you bring that representation into your classroom. it's important that you engage with the National Science of Black Engineers, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, and other Black organizations and Latinx organizations so that your students can see that representation. All right. The next issue is the opportunity gap. Students have not had the opportunity to engage in STEM education, in STEM research. Sometimes, like I said, they haven't engaged in science, any sort of science laboratory. Sometimes they actually don't have certified STEM teachers actually teaching them. Right? Sometimes they don't have those opportunities after school or even during the summer. So I think about our academy. Now, we do have free classes for students. We have free programs. But we also have programs that cost. Well, these programs cost $250 for 1 week. That same family can spend $250 to send their kid to a summer camp for the entire summer. So a lot of your STEM programs are expensive. So Black and Latinx students, especially those who don't have, they're of lower class, they can't afford those opportunities. The next one is the cultural perception gap. And what I mean by this is that goes back to bias. That's the bias that Black and Latinx students are intellectually inferior, that STEM is too much of a challenge for them, that they don't value education. And so when teachers have that sort of mindset and they're teaching students, then they're going to have those lower expectations for them. The next is the STEM education gap, and this is specifically about what's happening in the classroom. They're not being prepared for the standardized tests, and not to say that's the only thing that we should look for in terms of merit, but they're not being prepared for them. They're not engaged in STEM in the classroom. So that becomes an issue. The next one is the generational gap. Now, when I talk about generational gap, I'm talking specifically about their parents. So as much as a parent might want their student to be successful, right? As much as a parent might value education, if that parent is not in STEM, it becomes a challenge for them to actually advocate on behalf of their student. It becomes a challenge for them to say, you should get involved in this program during the summer, or you should get involved in that program. They don't even know where those resources are. And so in terms of the generational gap, it's important that we are educating parents on how to advocate on behalf of their students, especially as it relates to STEM. And that's not happening. We didn't receive funding for this, but one thing that my academy had actually proposed was actually providing parents with STEM skills, teaching them how to code, so that they could eventually go into a STEM field themselves if they wanted. If they didn't, we also expect for our parents to actually attend courses with their students when they're involved in some of our pre-enrichment programs. So we get the parents involved. We let them know how to advocate on behalf of their students when they're not in our space. That information needs to go out to parents. The next one is the economic gap, and this goes back to being able to afford some of those enrichment programs that are STEM specific. Like I said, it's expensive, and some families just cannot afford them. So a lot of the programs that we do that are specifically for Black and Latinx students, they're either free or at very low cost. We also provide scholarships. The next one is the identification gap. And so when we talk about the identification gap, we do not have a racially based STEM identification protocol that identifies STEM talent in Black and Latinx youth. Right? So let's just say you have a black male in a classroom, and this black male is sitting there taking apart his phone. Then you have a white male in the classroom doing the same thing. More often than not, The black male will be said he's being destructive and will be kicked out of class. And the white male, they'll say, oh, well, he's being curious. We have to change our thought process about who Black and Latinx students are. And we have to define some sort of protocol that suggests this is how you identify that talent. Community college, I would love for you all to create something like that, okay? I haven't gotten to that point. The final issue is this sort of STEM professional to educator gap. So you do have those who are STEM professionals who want to come back to the classroom. Now, even though they have a master's in the content area or even a PhD in the content area, because of teacher certification processes, it's very hard for them to go into the classroom. It's almost like they have to go back to undergrad in order to get a teacher certification in order to go into the classroom. I could definitely see community colleges coming up with some sort of expedited process that provides STEM professionals with their teacher certification so that they can go into the classrooms. A lot of our STEM professionals, they go into industry first. Why? Because you're going to make more money in industry. You know, let's be real honest. You're going to make 3 and 4 times the amount going into industry versus going into education. But at some point, those STEM professionals might want to come into the classroom. They might want to give back to their communities, and we've made it very difficult for them to do so. So that's the systemic problem. And like I said, we have to address these issues collectively and not in isolation if we want to bring more Black and Latinx youth into this STEM education and career pathway. I provided all of you all with an article. In this article, it's laid out some of the issues and how to specifically address those issues. So the next sort of level, the secondary level, right? We've addressed the problem. Now we need to motivate the students. So how do we go about doing that? I've already shared those factors of motivation with you. Well, the first thing is we need early STEM exposure. And when I talk about early STEM exposure, I'm talking about pre-K through 16. This has to start early, and it has to be consistent throughout the years. It has to be in school, after school, on weekends, during the summer. They have to have that constant exposure to STEM, and it has to be applicable to their lives. Next, we need a culturally responsive STEM curriculum. If the students don't see themselves represented in the curriculum, they're not going to be vested into it. So we have to be culturally responsive. We have to personalize our approach. We have to make sure that they're solving the problems that they want to solve, not the ones you all want them to solve, the ones that they want to solve. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them. It's about the student. So we have to be culturally responsive in our coursework. This third one, and this is the one that's probably the biggest challenge. We have to talk about race. We have to have conversations about racial inequities that exist. We have to have conversations about oppressive systems that have been put in place historically and the persistence of those oppressive systems. We have to talk about the actual contributions that Black and Latinx professionals have made to the field for thousands of years. We have to talk. And if we're not talking, then our students will know. They'll know that we're not that concerned about race, or we'll go back to that same thing. I don't see color. You can't say that. You can't think that. We have to think about race as something that's positive and say, yeah, we do have these different cultures that exist within our society. And all of these different cultures, they have these sort of cultural norms and traditions. Well, how can we use that in our coursework to improve the success rate of our students? So we have to talk about race. And it's just not talking with your students about race. You all have to talk to each other about race and what that means for your classes, for your academic departments. Next, we have to have personalized assessments and evaluations. As you know, every single student learns differently. Well, especially for our Black and Latinx students, you need to personalize your approach. Sometimes the assessments of them, because you want your students to see that they have strengths, right? And so sometimes you have to personalize those assessments in order for those strengths to come out. And then you have to personalize how you evaluate each student. Some students do great on written tests. Some students, they need oral exams. Some students, they need to do a project and they can actually show you, that they understand. You have to personalize your approach for our students. But that also goes back to understanding who they are, knowing your students so you can know how they learn. And finally, you have to have STEM leadership development. I'm going to tell you a little bit later about my Promise Pre-Enrichment program that I run. Well, my students, my high school students, actually serve as the mentors and tutors of that program, and that program is for students in 5th through 9th grade. Guess what that does? For the younger students, all of a sudden they see somebody who looks like them, who's engaged in STEM, who enjoys learning, and that motivates them. And then remember, I told you the number one factor of motivation in our students is the obligation that they have to their communities. So when they're engaged in being a tutor and mentor in this Promise program, that motivates them because they're giving back. They're helping those who are coming after them. They're able to serve as positive role models. It's also important that this STEM leadership development happen in the classroom. What projects do you have? And do you have different student leaders who are guiding those projects? And if you don't, it's going to be important that you bring that into the classroom and you allow students to lead. You talk to them what it means to be a servant leader. You talk to them about relational leadership, and then you give them that opportunity to lead it in the STEM space. If you do all of those things, that will definitely help to enhance the motivation of your Black and Latinx students to engage in STEM. And again, you have more of an explanation in the article that I provided you. So I want to talk a little bit about being culturally responsive. And this is important. The first thing is a lot of our Black and Latinx students, they struggle with their racial identity. They're in conflict with it. So you need to help them to develop a growth mindset in your classroom, right? The second, you have to personalize your approach. Like I said, you have to personalize the teaching and learning approach with these students. Third, you have to make sure that they're solving problems that are important to them. Community problems, right? And then you have them take it a step further and focus on national problems and even global problems. You think about the water crisis in Flint, right? That's something that may hit home to some of your students. How can they solve that particular problem? One thing that we've done is actually begin to address poverty. We've integrated the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals into our curriculum. And so then we look at poverty, and we look at poverty from a local perspective. And then the students talk about how they were on free and reduced lunch programs or their peers on free and reduced lunch programs. And then we had them take a look at the history of that. So they have an understanding that that model actually began with the free breakfast programs by the Black Panther Party, right? So now it's something that relates back to them. And then we talk about, well, the free and reduced lunch program, that was one way that has addressed this issue, but it has not solved poverty. So how can you solve the issue of poverty in your community? Well, one thing the students came up with is urban agriculture. Well, we can begin to grow our own foods. That's basically free. So we researched how to go about doing that. We taught students how to grow their own food. Then we worked with engineering so that they could develop all of the machines and equipment needed to actually grow their food in an urban way, right? And then we took it a step further and we focused on innovation and entrepreneurship. And we taught them, well, how do you now turn this into a business? Giving back to those in need, but you need to be able to sustain this, right? So then selling your product to those not in need, right? So we were able to actually partner with the farmers market in our local community, and our students are selling their products. And that was their solution to solving poverty. But the reason I talked about this example is this was a problem that hit home to our students. It's something they wanted to solve. We taught them how to go out and research the data. We connected it back to their history, right? And then we taught them how to make it into a business. So now our students are STEM literate. They know how to analyze problems, right? And they know how to be entrepreneurs. All by being culturally responsive in our classroom. And they loved it. So it's important to be culturally responsive. I'm not going to go through this because I still have a lot to go through, but I will provide this PowerPoint to Siri, and I'll help make sure that she passes it out to you, because this is it's a series of equity considerations that you need to think about as you're planning your STEM curriculum. All right, so focused on motivation, surfacing student thinking, intellectual engagement, engaging in scientific and mathematics discourse, as well as in-process meaning making. So you'll get this information. But now, and summative meaning making. But now what I would like to talk about is the last aspect of the D-STEM equity model, right? This is bridging the gap, bringing it all together. The reality is that we need policy from upper level administration that says, as an institution, we're going to make STEM equity a priority.